So, 200 years ago today, a relatively small ship slipped down the ways of the Royal Dockyard, here in Pembroke Dock. Her name was Erebus. No one present that day in June 1826 could possibly have imagined where that ship's journey would end. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Russell Potter.
The Franklin expedition is sometimes thought of as a kind of a contagious obsession. We call it Franklinitis. There is no cure, in case you happen to get it. You might have it today. But the element that is sometimes forgotten is the human element. The fact that we're talking about 129 men who sailed forth into the unknown and whose ultimate fate may never be fully known. And here, of course, is James Clark Ross, famous portrait, the handsomest man in the Navy, people said, and perhaps that was true. So here we've gotten into the 1830s. Erebus has been out. It had brief service in the Mediterranean. It turned out there wasn't a great war going on as there had been for terror, so it was not placed into service bombarding anyone's coast. Now, James Clark Ross had been to the Arctic already with his uncle John Ross. They had discovered there the North Magnetic Pole. And so this search for terrestrial magnetism and knowledge about the Earth's magnetic field was one of the drivers here, but also just for geographical knowledge. Was there land? How much land? Of what extent? Was it accessible in any way? And this is a chart that shows their whole voyage. I mean, it's really amazing. Taken place over 3 years. So in 1839 to 43, I think. And, they're trying to... You see that there's the Ross Ice Shelf, as it's now known. I think they just originally called it the Barrier, or the Victoria Barrier, because it adjoins the place they named Victoria Land. They were trying their darndest to get through, past, or around this, and in several years' endeavor discovered that that was simply not going to happen. But in the process, almost circumnavigated the entire continent. A few years later, this fellow here, Sir John Franklin. And so it was thought that Franklin might be just the man to undertake that quest for the Northwest Passage. And indeed, Franklin's plan was simply to explore, to map the magnetic field, to chart the coasts, and to find a way through. And I think it's that idea of finding a way through that was so enticing. Now, some modifications were made to the ship. They were very important. I want to thank my friend Peter Carney for this sketch. They wanted engines. Now, these were auxiliary engines only. They were not to actually propel the ship on a regular basis. But should they be stuck in a calm and need to go in a direction contrary to the winds to penetrate a promising lead in the ice, these ex-railway engines that were installed shortly before sailing were to be the means that they would employ. This is actually an engraving that depicts what turned out to be some of the trials for those engines. So they took them out on the Thames. They fired up the engines to see what they could do, and they made 4 knots. So this is just a map from our book to give you an idea of their initial sailing. They went up the coast of Greenland here. They were still accompanied by one vessel, a transport vessel, the Broadoak Junior, which had provisions and supplies, the idea being that they would replenish the provisions that had been consumed in the first few months of the voyage. And right here, at a place known as Disco Island, they had their last harborage, and the transport sailed with the last letters. Now, the idea was, of course, they would winter over. They would find a safe harbor, they would put the ships in a protected position, and they would wait for the ice to thaw and then go on the next year. It was anticipated, and some deaths were to be anticipated. Unfortunate, but not unexpected entirely. So we have the 3 sailors who were buried there. John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell, the first 3 stones there. It's also telling that the 4th stone there, a fellow named William Morgan, I think, was a searcher for Franklin, not a member of the crew, and they thought, well, we have 3 graves, we'll put him there, and now there'll be 4. Little things got left behind, a glove, a little piece of paper saying "until called," which is one of my favorite scraps, all kinds of little things. This wasn't discovered until 1850. I think it's also interesting to note, by that time, hopes were obviously drawing a little to a peak, because it had been 5 years since the men had been seen. And members of the families of some of the expedition members were here. Robert Goodsir, the brother of the naturalist, was here, and as he approached the graves, he kept saying to himself, "I hope I do not see a name I recognize," and he did not. And then onward we go into the deeper Arctic. This is King William Island. It's a phrase you'll hear a lot when you talk about Franklin. This is my first visit there in 2004. And I love this photograph because it gives a sense of the enormity of it, the lack of features on the landscape, this was April, by the way, and the extraordinary just isolation that one would feel there. And it was off the coast of this island that the two ships wintered in again. They weren't able to get themselves quite into a safe harbor, so they're out on the pack ice, which is far from ideal. And yet they hoped and anticipated that perhaps, as expected, next year the ice would break up and they would be on their way. And the ice did not break up. So this is the famous Victory Point note. It's famous in part because of the irony and contrast between its central contents and its marginal contents. So this was first left in 1847 in a cairn on King William Island. It indicates the proceedings of the expedition so far, and at the bottom of that it says, Sir John Franklin commanding, all well. All well, right? It's notable also that Franklin didn't sign this note himself. Previous ones he had, so he might have already been ill. But at any rate, the spirit of the men must have been generally positive, and that seemed to be the indication that would be left. A year later, they removed the note from the cairn where they had left it, and the marginal note there recounts what had happened since. Franklin had died not too long after this note was left, so Crozier and Fitzjames were the commanders of the expedition. 20-odd men had additionally died, officers and sailors, and they had made a fateful decision to abandon the ships. I'm sure it wasn't made easily. The whole concept of the Northwest Passage and getting through depended upon ships. No provision had been made for any other option. So what they did was they actually built sledges. The ship's carpenters presumably constructed these. They put nails in the men's boots so that they'd be able to drag effectively across the snow and ice. And in April of 1848, out they went, pulling these sleds laden with enormous weight of food in the hopes of reaching safe haven. So this is a map that was put together in the early 20th century, collecting all of the testimony from Inuit and also all of the accounts by Western explorers. And you see those two little outlines of ships, one marked S, one marked H. Based on what the Inuit told Schwatka, that seemed to be the likely position of one of the ships. Based on what Hall had recorded, it might be slightly further to the south. And then these two gentlemen came along, both friends of mine. On the left, we have Dave Woodman. His role was to collect the written Inuit evidence, which had been moldering in various archives for a very long time, and actually started putting it together, connecting the dots. Some witness says this, another witness corroborates that. Third witness has a slightly different story. Is it the same story or a different one or a different interpretation of the same events? Was this person an eyewitness or just relaying information from others? And he wrote a book called Unraveling the Franklin Mystery, and he did quite a bit of unraveling. But as it turned out, of course, Inuit oral tradition was still alive and well. It hadn't disappeared. This is my late friend Louis Kamukak on the right, who lived in Johaven, which is the town, the settlement nearest to the site of what turned out to be the site of Erebus. And he had collected stories from his own family and from others in the community that echoed and reinforced and gave some detail to these earlier written transcriptions. So based on that, starting in the 1990s, Dave Woodman went up himself, and then later Parks Canada began their searches as well. This shows all the different search areas from various years. The sites that I pointed out to you are down there at the bottom, those two little search areas. After searching those for several years, it occurred to them that perhaps, as we all feared, the ships had been smashed to splinters further north, north of the Royal Geographical Society Islands, so they moved the search area up there. And then fate intervened, as it so often does. So Doug Stenton, who you will know is the person who has been doing the DNA testing and whatnot, was on site to provide archaeological support, and his helicopter pilot, Alex Sterling, looked over at this place where they were supposed to install a GPS beacon and said, "What's that? What's that?" And it turns out, you can see him holding it in his hand, it's a davit pintle. So you think of the davits coming out and lowering the boats, and then they turn back. And it's on a rotating piece of metal that holds the wood called a pintle. And it weighs 30, 40 pounds at least, it's obviously not going to have drifted from anywhere. If it's on the land, the reasoning was, the ships must be nearby. Now, going back to the Parks Canada guys, they had two little boats, the Kinglet and the Gannet, and each one of them had a sonar towfish. So they're going back and forth and back and forth. You know the story of Titanic and Robert Ballard. He called it mowing the lawn. Back and forth and back and forth. And Ryan Harris, who was the team lead at the time, had been staring at a blank screen for the better part of 6 years. But they decided, well, let's take the towfish over and see what's near where the davit pintle was found. And legend has it, he pointed to the screen, he said, "That's it! That's it!" And it was it. We didn't actually know when it was first found which of the two ships it might be. But it was found almost exactly where Inuit testimony said. So what they did is they took the sonar images, compared them to the ship's plans, which I've shown you earlier, and discovered that it was in fact Erebus, Franklin's own ship of command. When it sank, the masts were still visible above the water. So we knew the depth. It couldn't be too deep or too shallow. The masts had to be visible, but not the ship itself. And that was a big way we limited the search area at the time. And it led to the ship itself, and here it is. You can see there's been some damage here. This is a composite photograph, of course. Some of the deck plating there has been pulled away. If you look closely, it's kind of hidden by the Parks Canada logo, but there's a piece of the deck plating there. And this is the stern of the ship. Franklin's great cabin, which was sort of his office space, I guess you'd call it. And the stern post and the rudder and all of these things had all kind of collapsed. There's a debris field there, which you can see. The ship's bell, of course, which would have been rung several times a day to announce the ship's watches. You can't quite see it in this photo, but you can see it in the hologram if you look. It has the broad arrow, and I noticed the two ship's bells in the corner of the chapel here also have the broad arrow, indicating Navy property. And the date 1845, which is very interesting. They decided to cast a new bell, because, of course, as we know, Erebus had been around since 1826, so a new bell for a new expedition. You'll see some of these plates in the display case here. This is a blue willow pattern, Island Pagoda. You can purchase this pattern yourself, and the dedicated Franklinites, I know, already have a couple of them. But what's interesting to me is, again, these are indications of shipboard life. The ceramic plates would have been used probably for the officers' mess, and also the junior officers or warrant officers' mess. And if you look on the bottom of them, you see the broad arrow again on the one on the left. You can't quite see here, but there are chip marks. Sometimes one, sometimes two, evidently used by the stewards to know which mess the plates would belong to. So even small things like plates had to be kept track of. And then, of course, this wonderful bottle of Samuel Oxley's concentrated ginger root extract. And I'm going to read the promotional copy here. It's said to be a cure for rheumatism, indigestion, windy complaints, nervous headaches, giddiness, and hypochondria. Of course, if it cured the last one, you wouldn't have to worry about the others. But what's interesting is it tells us that somebody on board the ship thought to bring their patent medicine with them, and that's kind of touching. And it was discovered with shot inside it. So someone had, for whatever reason, either weighed down the bottle with shot or decided to store some shot in it. We don't really know. But that's a wonderful, wonderful artifact. And this is the Marines' belt plate. So they would have had a belt across their chest, and this plate would have been right about in the middle of it. As Michael Palin says in his book, it's a crowned lion on top of a lion. But this is the symbol of the Royal Marines. Now, each ship had several Royal Marines. And to me, these are some of the most fascinating people on the expedition. One of them, William Braine, is buried at Beechey Island. But the others, these were men who had not signed up for special Arctic service. They weren't getting double pay, as the sailors were. Some of them had been recruited by a mechanism slightly less aggressive than a press gang. And many of them were career officers in the Marines. And they were assigned to the ships for security, should there be a mutiny or some trouble, but also to guard any valuable properties and to help maintain order. So, assuming that things went well, their mission was a little uncertain. And these men found themselves in this extraordinary situation that they couldn't have anticipated, I'm sure, on the day that they enlisted. So this is one of their breastplates from their belt. And then this shoe. Now you'll see the shoe in here, this very shoe. It's been cleaned up. But amazingly enough, this is just silt that has settled into the shoe when it was on the lower deck. That silt preserved the contents of the shoe, including human DNA. So if we could find a match, which we haven't yet, we could know whose shoe this was. It's the bottom part of a boot, so the upper is missing there. So again, something very humble, something very ordinary, something that probably somebody didn't mean to leave behind. And yet here it is, and capable of testifying to its owner. And most fascinating, people always ask me, were any written materials recovered? And obviously a written record, a log book, well, this would solve the whole thing, maybe. I hope we don't solve the whole thing. But it could give us a tremendous amount of information. So, and with the last dive season, the divers brought up this leather portfolio. If you look closely, you might be able to see it's got a device of two swans with their necks intertwined. And we said, oh my God, it's a book with maybe sketches or notes or drawings in it. When I went to Park Canada's laboratory office, sad to say, I saw a photograph of the other side. And unfortunately, you can see that the paper inside this portfolio has disintegrated and accreted. So it's kind of one mass of pulp. Now, they've been able to read scrolls at Herculaneum using X-rays without unfolding them, because of course they're all burnt and they would perish if unfolded. Maybe something like that could happen here. But this is from Edmund Hoare's room, his captain's steward storeroom. In the same storeroom, we found a pencil case and a watercolor kit. So I have a strong feeling that if this could be recovered, what we might actually see would be visual depictions of events during the course of the expedition. So there's always the hope that these kinds of things would happen. Now, unfortunately, due to budgetary constraints and other concerns, the underwater archaeology team is on hold right now. So there will not be a dive this season, and we don't know when and if those will be able to restart. But they do have an extraordinary amount of material. Now, the first 2 years of dives, that's the material that went to the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and that's the material you will see some of here. But the remaining material is still in their laboratories, and you never know what you will find in a laboratory. Here's what I found on my visit. This heavy metal square with a little knob on it, and inside the knob you could see something screwed in here, but what? It was thought to maybe be a base for some kind of a pole or something. This would be a stanchion base, they thought. Well, that's kind of fancy. And what's the little cloth bit doing on a stanchion base? That wouldn't belong there. And then I looked at the other side, and I saw this little square, and I realized it's exactly the same size as the daguerreotypes. And I had heard, no, we've never been able to verify this until now, that the same camera that was used to take those sad, well, what became sad, portraits, was loaded on board the Erebus for their use during the expedition. And I thought, well, that looks an awful lot like a daguerreotype plate. What did this be for? And I knew also that daguerreotype plates had to be polished elaborately before they would be ready to be sensitized and exposed. And I thought, could that be a plate polisher? It was just a guess. So I wrote to the president of the Daguerrean Society of North America, who happened to live in Toronto, and he said, oh my God, it's a Johnson polisher. Look at Johnson polisher. I didn't even know such a thing existed. But you can see the little cuticle, the little cutaway there. You put your plate on this thing and you held it out, and you'd have a treadle wheel where you push it like a sewing machine, and it would take a bit of sheepskin or something and spin around and around and around to polish a plate. So now we know that indeed they did have camera apparatus, and that it probably was used. Yeah, and there was just a random coincidence. What's that? So it's the same thing as the davit pintle, really. What's that? We should always ask that question. But now, of course, we come to the most telling, in a way sad, but also in a way relieving news, that we've been able to identify some of these men whose remains and bones have been out there for all of this time. Now, this is a photograph from 1992. It was when there was an expedition there by archaeologists. They had been brought there by a fellow named Barry Ranford, who was an amateur photographer in Ontario, who had the Franklin bug. And he had found this skull lying on the beach. He thought it was a bleach bottle when he first saw it. So the archaeologists came, they cataloged the bones, they examined the bones, and eventually, after studying them, they reburied them. One thing they did notice on these bones were cut marks, and it indicated that, as my late friend Ann Keenley sighed, who was the lead forensic pathologist, said, consistent with defleshing. Now, bearing in mind this is just one group of individuals, we don't know if it extended to other people, but this was near the boat place where those skeletons were found. And so this skull for a long time was just an enigma. It was on the cover of magazines. People said, I wonder who that is. And we had no means to do so until Doug Stenton managed to extract DNA from one of its teeth. Now, this is the skull turned around. It was prepared for facial reconstruction. You can't quite see the tooth there. It's covered up by part of the bone. But that's where they found intact strands of DNA. They first did a facial reconstruction, hitting the wrong button here, and came up with this fellow. Some people thought he looked like James Reed, and they cheated because they put a tam o' shanter on his head. It's just a facial reconstruction, but that's who we thought it might be. And then the DNA came through, and it turned out to be John Gregory, who was one of the engineers hired to maintain the engines, in this case for HMS Erebus. We have one of his letters in our book, and as all of us can confirm, he had beautiful handwriting. He was an older man who had technical training, who had been working for the railroad company, and he was brought on, as it's not a naval person. He was married and had kids, so he writes to his wife, signing off, your affectionate husband, John Gregory. He was the very first one we identified using DNA. Then there was this discovery, which was both sad and shocking, but also extraordinary. This turned out to be, this mandible, which was again found in 1992, originally turned out to be that of James Fitzjames, the commander aboard Erebus. It also has cut marks consistent with defleshing. That, I think, was a hard blow for many of us. We didn't like to think that James Fitzjames, the most jovial and capable writer of letters of the whole lot, had not only died at this place, but had been the subject of cannibalism. Some of us started to wonder, why would you remove a jawbone? That doesn't sound like a very appetizing thing to do, especially the captain's jawbone. But when I talked to Anne Keenly's side, she had a better explanation, I think, which is that if you are starving and you are desperately looking for something to eat, the easiest way to get to the brain is by removing the jawbone and going in this way. And you can get at the material there. But it's a very, very shocking development, but at the same time, an indication, right? What does it mean? Did Fitzjames stay behind to care for the sick and those unable to go any further? Is this a sign of his beneficence? I like to think so, but we can't know for sure. And then, of course, we have David Young. Now, similarly, I don't have the skull handy as an image, but the skull was reconstructed, and this was Diana Trepkov, who's the forensic reconstructor that did many of these sketches. And so we got some idea of what he might have looked like. And the thing about him was the jawbone. The jawbone was very, very telling because his second and third molars hadn't finished descending. And so already the thought was, by Anne Keenly's side and others, this was the jawbone of a very young person. Using standard metrics, she estimated the age at 14, which didn't correspond with anybody since we knew all the cabin boys were at least 20. So it was quite extraordinary when it came back that this was indeed David Young, the cabin boy aboard the Erebus. Back when he was only a jawbone, my good friend John Wilson wrote this young adult novel about him, Across Frozen Seas. I think he was drawn to this figure because he had been a young man himself, and he thought that young readers would be drawn to the story of a younger person. And it's quite a wonderful novel if you can get a hold of it. So I think here we're connecting all kinds of stories. One of the youngest members of the expedition, which I think is very striking, and also somebody who was also there at the very end of all things. We know that David Young was there. Then we have William Oren. He was actually one of the older sailors, 39 at time of sailing. We don't have any elaborate reconstructions because there's not enough bone elements left. But Doug Stenton and his colleagues discovered his parents' gravestone. And at the bottom of it, though I can't make it out here, they've transcribed it as William Oren, son of the above. It's his parents' grave. And likewise, one of the crew of the unfortunate Erebus and the ill-fated expedition under Sir John Franklin, of whose fate no discovery has yet been made. And to me, that's the most touching part, because even in death, his parents were still hoping, still remembering their son. Then there's John Bridgens. He was a subordinate officer steward, would have worked in the wardroom. He's portrayed here in the AMC series The Terror. They made him somewhat older. He's actually was, I think, only 26 years old when they sailed, so he was not a very senior fellow. But still a very nice performance, I think, by John Lynch. And if you've listened to some of the radio interviews and so forth, they often use a little snippet from him talking about the awesome terrors of the Arctic, and he did a fine job in the performance. And then our very last identification, this is from Terror, not Erebus, but I like to think of the men in the sister ship as well. And when Francis Leopold McClintock was traveling along the southern coast of King William Island, he came upon a skeleton partly clad, face down in the snow. And the skeleton was striking in several ways. One, it was still wearing a button-down frock coat. The buttons were cloth covered, which is unusual, suggested perhaps an officer's steward. And he also had his neckerchief tied in a steward's bow knot. These are the ways that men on board ship distinguished their ranks, so the idea that he could be anything other than a steward didn't make any sense. But the papers he carried with them, which are cryptic and have not really, I've spent years trying to decipher them. I call them the Dead Sea Scrolls of the North. Others call them the Peglar Papers. He wrote them backwards. They're full of cryptic rhymes, accounts of visits to the South Seas, which I'm sure were very warming to him when he was up in the Arctic, but very little, it seems, to relate to their actual circumstances. But it has the seaman's certificate of one Harry Peglar. So we assumed a steward or someone in that capacity must have been friends with Mr. Peglar, because he was a senior sailor. He was not likely to be suddenly turning into an officer's servant. So we always wondered who that could be. And when Doug brought back the DNA from this skeleton, which is really remarkable because the skeleton had been removed years ago and had been lost in a museum, never to be found again, but Doug went back to the site and found a few bones. And those bones told us that it actually was Harry Peglar with Peglar's papers, which interestingly complicates a mystery that turns out not to be a mystery. Here's his neckerchief, tied in that distinctive manner. Here are the cloth-covered buttons. These are both in the collections at Greenwich because they were brought back by McClintock. Now there's another chapter to be written. Back to those papers. We'll have to see if perhaps the knowledge that it was indeed Peglar who carried them fills out our portrait and gives us a fresh way to look at that material. The Franklin story ends in an ellipsis. ... We don't know what's happening next. We don't know what the next discovery will be. All that we know is that there will be more, and we will continue to yearn, and we'll continue to learn, and maybe someday we'll have a clearer picture of what happened to those men in their final days.
His Majesty the King, I'm delighted to open this special exhibition.
Hey, well done.
Homeward bound on the mighty deep, lying in my hammock, I fell asleep. I dreamed a dream, I thought it true, concerning Franklin and his bold crew. With 100 seamen he sailed away to the frozen ocean in the month of May, to seek a passage around the pole where all poor sailors do sometimes go. Through cruel hardships they vainly strove, their ships on mountains of ice was drove. Only the Eskimo with his skin canoe was the only one who ever came through. fate of Franklin no man may know. The fate of Franklin no tongue can tell. And Lord Franklin among his sailors to dwell. And now my burden it gives me pain. For my Lord Franklin I sail amain. 10,000